Fake HOA cops broke my nephew's fingers, but Grandpa, a war interrogator, crushed their legs on cam. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. It all started when my nephew, Jordan, finally got a place of his own. Fresh out of college, full of hope and eager to step into the next chapter of his life, he signed a lease in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the city. It wasn't anything too fancy, but to him it felt like a palace. A clean two-bedroom unit in a gated community, complete with tree-lined streets, a gym, a shared pool, and even a little park tucked behind the clubhouse. For someone used to living in cramped dorm rooms and rundown apartment shares, this felt like paradise. Jordan had always been the type to look on the bright side of things. He saw the move not just as a chance to live independently, but as a symbol of progress. A blank slate. The start of something better. He was the kind of person who took pride in small things, mowing his little patch of lawn, saying good morning to neighbors, even keeping a little herb garden on his balcony. He was excited about the community too. It seemed peaceful. The kind of place where people knew each other's dogs by name and waved when they passed by in their cars. The HOA was mentioned in the welcome packet, but it didn't seem like a big deal. Just the usual stuff: no loud music after 10 p.m., keep trash bins out of sight, park within the lines. Nothing Jordan couldn't handle. In fact, he liked the idea of rules at first. To him, it meant the neighborhood cared, that it was safe. That first month went by like a dream. He was settling in, meeting a few neighbors here and there, and slowly decorating his place. It wasn't until the second month that things started to feel off. Little things at first. A warning note stuck to his door about a garden gnome on his porch, not HOA approved, apparently. Then someone left a notice on his windshield about how his car was parked too far forward in the driveway. Jordan shrugged it off, figuring maybe he'd missed something in the guidelines. No big deal. He was new after all. Still learning. But something about it all felt strange. The notices didn't come with any official HOA letterhead. They weren't signed. No dates, no names. Just vague warnings typed on plain white paper. Sometimes the wording was almost aggressive. It didn't sit right with him, but again, he was trying to fit in, trying not to stir the pot. He just wanted to enjoy his little corner of the world. He didn't know then that the people slipping those notes weren't actually from the HOA at all. They weren't elected. They weren't even real officers. They were something else entirely. And Jordan was about to find out the hard way. At first, no one really noticed them. They started showing up on foot, two men in matching dark polos, khaki tactical pants, black boots. The polos had a patch stitched over the chest that simply read HOA compliance, nothing official looking, just blocky white text against a navy background. They wore radios on their belts, carried clipboards, and walked around the neighborhood like they owned the place. No one questioned it. Most people just assumed they were some sort of hired patrol brought in by the homeowners association, maybe a new security team, maybe volunteers. They didn't introduce themselves, but they made their presence known. They began their rounds slowly, watching people, jotting notes, peering into driveways, pointing at fences and garbage cans as if mentally cataloging every inch of the neighborhood. It didn't take long before they started knocking on doors. Not to say hello. Not to welcome anyone. Just to issue warnings. They came to Jordan's place on a Wednesday morning. One of them knocked hard, 3 sharp pounds, like a cop at your door. Jordan answered in pajama pants, toothbrush still in hand. The taller of the two men didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a name, just looked down at a clipboard and said, "You've got unapproved planters on your balcony. That's a violation." Jordan blinked, still half asleep. "Sorry, what violation? I didn't see anything about that in the rules." The man didn't explain. He just repeated himself, colder this time, and told Jordan he had 24 hours to remove the planters or further action would be taken. It would have been easy to laugh it off if it had stopped there. But it didn't. The very next day, they were back. This time, they scolded an elderly neighbor across the street for using a hose on the wrong watering day. Another woman was threatened with a citation for having a flag, an actual American flag, mounted on a pole near her front door. One family got told their wind chimes were creating noise disturbances. And the worst part? None of these so-called violations were backed by anything in writing. When people asked for proof or guidelines, the fake officers deflected. "It's in the handbook," they'd say, or "you'll receive something in the mail." But nothing ever came. People started whispering about them. No one had seen them before that month. No one knew their names. And when a few neighbors tried calling the HOA office to ask about the new enforcement team, they were met with confusion. The HOA apparently hadn't authorized any new patrols. No uniforms, no officers, no surprise inspections. Still, the men kept coming. They walked the neighborhood like sentries, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone. They'd stand at corners, arms folded, staring down residents as they pulled into their driveways. They left anonymous notes tucked into doors. They took photos of people's yards. They shouted across the street at a teenager for skateboarding. They followed a woman to her mailbox and warned her about unauthorized garden lighting. It was like living under silent surveillance. And just like that, the friendly, easygoing atmosphere Jordan had moved in for started to shift. People began to keep to themselves. Garage doors stayed closed. Conversations at the dog park turned cautious. No one wanted to be the next target. Jordan, though, couldn't shake the feeling that this went deeper. That these men weren't just pretending to have authority, they were enjoying it. Too much. And things were about to get worse. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. The air was warm, the sun high, and Jordan had just finished washing his car in the driveway. It was something he liked doing, almost like a ritual. Music playing low on a Bluetooth speaker, bucket of suds at his feet, sleeves rolled up. A small moment of peace after a long week. He wasn't doing anything loud or reckless. Just minding his business, a sponge in one hand and a can of tire shine sitting off to the side. He didn't hear them approach. The same two men, the self-appointed HOA compliance officers, walked up the sidewalk like they were on a mission. No greeting. No questions. The taller one pointed to the hose and said, flatly, "You're in violation of the water usage policy. We've already warned you." Jordan paused, confused. "What are you talking about? There's no water restriction in the guidelines. I checked after last time." The shorter one stepped in, clipboard in hand. "Second offense. That's grounds for a fine. And a citation." He didn't offer a paper or a warning, just tapped the clipboard with his pen like it meant something. Jordan set the sponge down and wiped his hands on a towel. "Look, I'm not trying to start anything. But I live here. I pay rent. If you're going to accuse me of something, I need to know who you are." The men looked at each other. "What's your name?" Jordan asked again, calmly but firmly. "You guys aren't wearing badges. No ID. Nothing from the HOA." The taller one stepped closer, too close. "You don't get to ask questions. You follow the rules or we deal with it our way." Jordan's heart pounded. He took a step back, raising his hands just slightly. "Okay, but I'm asking for some basic accountability here. That's not unreasonable." That was when the shorter one lunged. It happened so fast, Jordan didn't even have time to react. One of them grabbed his wrist, tight, twisting it back behind his body in a move that was way too practiced for a neighborhood compliance check. Jordan cried out in pain, struggling to pull free, but the taller man stepped in and shoved him forward against the hood of his own car. "Stop resisting," one of them barked. "I'm not resisting. Let go," Jordan shouted, his voice cracking from the pain. But they didn't let go. There was a horrible snap, then another. Jordan screamed. His hand went numb instantly and the world spun for a moment as he dropped to the ground. The shorter man stood over him, breathing heavily while the other checked the street for anyone watching. Jordan's fingers, his dominant hand, were already swelling, bent at angles that weren't natural. The pain shot through his arm like fire. He couldn't move. Could barely speak. He just lay there on the pavement, staring up at the blue sky, trying to understand what had just happened. The men didn't offer help. Didn't call for an ambulance. They just muttered something about him learning his lesson and walked off like nothing had happened. He never even got their names. A neighbor across the street came running over minutes later, having heard the shouting. She called 911. The paramedics arrived not long after, along with 2 actual police officers. But by then, the fake HOA cops were long gone. Jordan ended up in the ER with 2 broken fingers and a fractured wrist. And that's when he finally told us everything. The call came in around 4:30 p.m. I remember because I was halfway through mowing the lawn when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't hear it over the sound of the blades, but something told me to check. It was Jordan's neighbor, Mrs. Chin. She had our number saved in case of emergencies, something Jordan insisted on when he moved out. She sounded panicked, her voice cracking as she explained what had happened, how she'd seen him on the ground, how the men had just walked away like they hadn't done anything. By the time we reached the hospital, Jordan was already being prepped for x-rays. His hand was wrapped in temporary gauze, swollen and bruised, his eyes red from trying not to cry in front of strangers. He kept saying, "I didn't do anything wrong. I swear, I didn't even touch them." Over and over. As if we might not believe him. As if he needed to explain. His mom, my sister, was a wreck. She clutched his good hand like he might slip away if she let go, her voice shaking as she demanded to know what had happened. My brother-in-law stood behind her, trying to keep it together, but I could see the anger in his jaw, the way he kept looking toward the hallway like he might go find someone to blame. But there was no one to yell at. The men were gone. No names, no record, no badge numbers. Just a broken hand and a whole lot of questions. And then there was Grandpa. He hadn't said a word the entire drive to the hospital. Just stared out the window, his fingers drumming lightly against the passenger door. But when he saw Jordan, really saw him, lying there, injured, frightened, humiliated, something shifted in him. My grandfather wasn't just any old man. Before retirement, he'd served in military intelligence. A war interrogator. Spent years overseas, trained to read faces, extract truths, handle pressure most people could barely imagine. He was the quiet type. Never boasted, never told war stories unless you asked. But you always knew there was more behind his eyes than he let on. That day, standing beside Jordan's hospital bed, he didn't ask what happened. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Jordan's hand, then at the rest of us. And finally, he said, "Tell me everything." Every word. From the beginning. Jordan did. Every detail. The uniforms. The clipboard. The false warnings. The way they twisted his arm. The way they looked at him like they weren't worried at all about consequences. Grandpa didn't interrupt. He just listened, nodded once, and then stepped out into the hallway without a word. We found him a few minutes later, sitting in the hospital's quiet waiting area, staring at nothing. When I asked if he was okay, he didn't answer right away. He just said, low and calm, "Those men aren't professionals. Not real ones. They're pretending. But they made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" I asked. He looked up, eyes hard as stone. "They left a witness. And they left my grandson in pain." He didn't say what he planned to do next. He didn't have to. We already knew. That night, Grandpa didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, just him and an old leather-bound notebook he used to keep from his army days. Every so often, he'd scribble something down, dates, details, descriptions, then sit back, thinking. His mind wasn't on revenge. It was on precision. Clarity. The kind of focus that comes from decades of dealing with dangerous men in dangerous places. This wasn't about rage. It was about control. He didn't talk much, but when he did, every word had weight. He started asking questions, sharp, direct, organized. He asked Jordan exactly how the men carried themselves, how they talked, if they used code words, if their radios had frequencies or just static. He wanted to know where they stood when they approached, how they scanned the area, whether they coordinated with hand signals or eye contact. To us, it sounded like overkill. To Grandpa, it was standard protocol. "The more a man wants power," he said quietly, "the more he leaves behind." In the garage, he dug through old trunks we hadn't seen in years. Out came a set of field binoculars, a small black camera with a telescopic lens, and a battered folder filled with lined forms from a different lifetime. Grandpa didn't rely on emotion, he built profiles. He understood behavior. He knew that the kind of men who pretended to be enforcers were often more fragile than they looked. Bullies in borrowed uniforms. Within a day, he knew the fake officers' routine better than anyone. He mapped their walking routes, clocked the times they showed up, marked where they loitered, who they interacted with, and how long they stayed in one spot. He borrowed an old neighbor's golf cart to patrol without raising suspicion. Quiet, slow, unthreatening. They never looked twice at him, just another old man cruising the neighborhood. They had no idea who they were dealing with. In the mornings, he observed from the porch with a pair of coffee mugs, one filled with black coffee, the other with small tools and a voice recorder he palmed like it was second nature. At night, he watched from inside, lights off, curtain drawn back, just enough to track movement. He wrote everything down. Patterns, posture, tone of voice. The exact moment one of them pulled a phone from his belt and took pictures of a resident's trash can. Grandpa wasn't gathering evidence for the police. Not yet. He was gathering leverage. He wanted to understand them, not just what they did, but why. What they got out of it. Whether they were working alone or answering to someone. Were they trying to enforce control over a neighborhood, or was it a front for something else? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they thought no one was watching. But someone was. And not just watching, calculating. Every evening, Grandpa updated a small corkboard in the guest room he'd turned into a makeshift war room. Photos, string, scribbled notes in red pen. To anyone else, it would have looked like the wall of a conspiracy theorist. But to him, it was a battlefield. A psychological map. A plan forming inch by inch. He wasn't just preparing to confront them. He was preparing to dismantle them. One knee at a time. It took Grandpa 4 days to decide it was time. He waited for a Saturday, same day of the week Jordan had been attacked. The neighborhood would be more active but still quiet enough for things to go unnoticed if they happened quickly. Predictable. That's what Grandpa liked. Predictable meant manageable. He dressed like he always did, pressed slacks, button-up shirt, soft-brimmed cap. Harmless. Nobody ever suspected the quiet old man with a limp. He walked with a slight cane, not because he needed it, but because he knew people underestimated those who looked fragile. And when people underestimate you, they get careless. That morning, just after 10 a.m., the fake officers appeared like clockwork. They came from the same side street, cutting through the common area, one always a few steps ahead of the other. Both in their navy polos, radios clipped, clipboards ready. They paused near a row of townhomes, pretended to jot something down, then turned toward a house with a wind chime on the porch. Probably looking for another reason to threaten someone. Grandpa was already waiting. He approached slowly just as they began to walk past him. "Morning," he said, his voice mild, warm, even. The shorter one gave him a nod, barely paying attention. The taller one looked him over, then went right back to scanning the houses. "You boys sure get around a lot for volunteers," Grandpa added, casual. They stopped. "Excuse me," the taller one said. "I said," Grandpa repeated, "you're volunteers, right? Because the HOA says they don't know who you are." There was a flicker in the taller man's eyes, just for a second. "A tell." Grandpa clocked it immediately. "We've got the authority to patrol," the shorter one said, stepping forward. "We're authorized. You don't need to worry about it, sir." "Oh, I'm not worried," Grandpa said, tilting his head. "I'm just curious. Where'd you get those uniforms?" "Internet." The taller one moved fast, faster than most people his age could have reacted to, but Grandpa wasn't most people. As the man stepped into his space, reaching for the clipboard like he was ready to use it as leverage, Grandpa's cane snapped upward, not to strike, but to deflect. A subtle parry that shifted the man's weight just enough. Then it happened. Grandpa stepped in close, pivoted off his back foot, and drove his own knee sideways into the soft point just above the man's kneecap. The pop was sickening. The man went down hard, gasping, his leg folding like paper. The shorter one shouted and lunged, but Grandpa didn't hesitate. He shifted his weight again, turned, and used the cane to hook the man's ankle. Not enough to trip, enough to slow. And then came the second blow, fast and precise, another strike to the side of the knee, lower this time, where the tendon was most exposed. The man collapsed with a grunt, grabbing his leg, trying to crawl backward. Both of them were down, groaning, cursing. One tried to reach for his radio, but Grandpa kicked it away with the heel of his shoe and pressed the cane across the man's chest, holding him firm without saying a word. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He didn't need to. "You don't hurt kids," he said, voice calm and low. "You don't lie to families. And you don't pretend to be something you're not." A few neighbors had started to peek out from their windows by then, quietly, not sure what was happening. One woman opened her door, phone already in her hand. She didn't ask questions. Just started recording. Grandpa leaned in close to the taller man who was still cradling his ruined knee. "I know your faces now," he said. "And so does everyone else." He stood back, leaving them both on the pavement. No blood. No weapons. Just two broken knees and the sharp, suffocating sting of public exposure. The fake authority they clung to so tightly had cracked. And Grandpa had done it without breaking a sweat. By the time the real police arrived, the two men were still on the ground, groaning and trying to explain what happened in between gasps of pain. But they weren't talking to Grandpa anymore. They were talking to a growing group of neighbors who had stepped out onto their porches, phones out, recording everything. Someone had posted the incident on the neighborhood message board within minutes. The caption was simple: "The fake HOA guys got taken down." Literally. Old man snapped their knees like pretzels. The post lit up like wildfire. By the time the officers started separating the crowd, half the neighborhood already knew what had gone down. The footage from one of the front porches caught the entire sequence: Grandpa's quiet approach, their aggression, and the precision of what followed. It wasn't some grainy, unclear video either. It was clean. Up close. Unmistakable. It didn't just show the confrontation, it captured the way the so-called officers moved, the way they spoke, and most importantly, how unprepared they were for a real challenge. No credentials. No training. Just a cheap imitation of power, ripped apart in under 2 minutes. The police were skeptical at first. They had questions, lots of them. Who were these men? Where were their badges? Who authorized them? When Grandpa calmly explained that the HOA had no record of them and multiple neighbors confirmed the same, the mood shifted. One of the officers called the HOA management office directly right there on the sidewalk. The manager answered with a tired voice and a clear answer: "We don't have any field compliance officers. None." It was over right then. A quick check of the fake officers' IDs revealed even more. One of them had a history of impersonation charges from out of state. The other? A security guard who had been let go from a local mall a few years back for excessive force. Neither of them had any legal standing to be operating in the neighborhood, let alone issuing threats and physically assaulting residents. The story spread beyond the block by nightfall. Someone uploaded the video to a community watchdog page on social media. Then it made its way to Reddit, where users were already nicknaming Grandpa things like Knee Reaper and Suburb Sniper. But the tone wasn't just amused, it was angry. People were shocked that two men could fake authority for weeks, walk the streets with radios and clipboards, and no one had stopped them until an elderly man with a cane decided he'd had enough. Neighbors who had stayed silent started speaking up. One by one, residents came forward to share their experiences. A woman admitted she'd been too scared to go to the pool after being threatened with a fine for bringing her toddler without proper registration. Another man said he'd stopped flying his drone after being warned it would be confiscated by the HOA. None of it had been real, none of it backed by policy. But fear is a powerful thing, and the fake officers had counted on people not asking questions. Now the truth was out. No more notes taped to doors. No more threats about wind chimes or hose usage. The spell had been broken. And it all started with one broken knee. Then another. The fallout came quickly. Within days, the news outlets picked up the story. It wasn't just a neighborhood scuffle anymore. This was about a serious case of fraud, intimidation, and assault. The fact that the fake HOA officers had been operating unchecked for so long made it a national story. And once the media started asking questions, the web of deceit unraveled even faster. The local police were thorough in their investigation. They found the officers were operating under false names and using fake identification to gain access to private properties. They had even gone so far as to collect fines from residents under the guise of enforcing HOA rules, money that was never reported to the actual HOA or any legitimate governing body. Everything about them screamed scam. Both men were arrested on charges of fraud, impersonating officers, and assault. The authorities quickly traced the money they'd collected back to a personal account, money they had been pocketing for months, exploiting the fear and confusion of the community. It wasn't just about what they did to Jordan. It was about how they'd been using fear as a weapon. They had preyed on a neighborhood that trusted its systems, manipulated people into believing they had power, and used intimidation to push their agenda. But the moment their power was questioned, it crumbled. The legal process was long, but the community rallied behind Jordan and Grandpa. A local attorney, someone who had grown up on the same block, volunteered to represent the family for free. The lawyer, a woman named Sarah Matthews, was relentless. She spoke to every resident who had been targeted, gathering testimonies of how the fake officers had bullied, threatened, and harassed people for minor infractions that didn't even exist. The town's anger turned into something more productive. People started showing up at city hall meetings, demanding accountability not just from the fraudsters, but from the HOA itself. In the meantime, the neighborhood began to heal. People who had been too scared to speak up started sharing their stories, their experiences. Some took to social media to express their relief. Others went door to door, telling their neighbors that they no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary fines. It was like a weight lifted off the community's shoulders, one small act of bravery at a time. Grandpa stayed mostly quiet throughout the whole process, letting others do the talking. He wasn't interested in glory. He was interested in justice. He visited the local police station a few times, mostly to give statements or follow up on the progress of the investigation. And when the court date arrived, he simply stood by Jordan, who was finally healing, and let the system work. No speeches. No demands. Just calm, quiet certainty that the truth would come out. As for the fake officers, their downfall was swift and total. The charges piled up. The trial was publicized. The evidence was irrefutable. In the end, the two men were sentenced to lengthy prison terms for fraud and assault, and the money they'd stolen was returned to the residents. It wasn't just about their punishment, it was a clear message to anyone who thought they could use a facade of authority to manipulate people. The law had teeth. The HOA itself underwent a complete overhaul. The Real Association had been shaken, but the scandal forced them to reassess their own security measures and transparency. They introduced new protocols to ensure that all enforcers would be properly trained, vetted, and identifiable. They even set up a hotline for residents to report suspicious activity immediately. No more fake officers. No more unchecked power. Jordan, with his broken fingers healed and the weight of the past few weeks slowly slipping away, felt a sense of peace return to the neighborhood. The entire block felt different. It was as if a fog had lifted. Families went back to sitting outside, chatting over fences, letting kids ride bikes down the street without fear of being hassled. The park was filled again, the pool crowded with people laughing and chatting like they had before the shadow of the fake officers hung over them all. And Grandpa? He didn't need to say much. He didn't want the attention. But you could see the pride in his eyes when he watched the neighborhood return to normal. The kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've done what needed to be done. The kind that comes from a lifetime spent reading people, anticipating every move, and making sure that when it counted, you were the one in control. The neighborhood wasn't just safe again. It was stronger. A few weeks after everything had settled, Grandpa sat on the porch with Jordan, the two of them sipping iced tea as the sun began to set behind the trees. The neighborhood had finally returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the memory of what had happened still lingered. It wasn't just the physical scars Jordan carried or the bruises on the community's trust, it was the quiet, unspoken weight of the lesson that had been learned. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak of the wood mingling with the evening's calm. He didn't look at Jordan right away. He just stared ahead, watching the kids play in the yard across the street. It was a warm evening and everything seemed to hum with life, as though the neighborhood had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. "You know, kid," Grandpa said, his voice slow, deliberate. "Sometimes it's not the loudest voice in the room that wins." He paused, took another sip of tea, then continued, his eyes narrowing as if he were choosing each word carefully. "Sometimes it's the quiet ones. The ones who watch. Who wait. Who know that when the time comes, they'll have the strength to act no matter what." Jordan nodded, his gaze shifting to the same kids, but his mind clearly still processing everything that had happened. He was still young, only 20, and the weight of what they'd been through wasn't something easily shaken off. He glanced at Grandpa, waiting for more, because Grandpa always had more. He always did. "You see," Grandpa went on, "people think justice comes from big, bold gestures. They think it's about making a scene, about being the loudest, the most powerful. But it's not. Justice is about standing firm, even when no one else is looking. It's about doing what's right, not because you'll get praise for it, but because it's what needs to be done." Grandpa's eyes softened as he looked over at Jordan. "You learned that, didn't you? Not in the way you expected, but in the way that counts." Jordan's hand hovered near his still healing fingers, the scars faint but present. He didn't say anything right away. The words felt heavy in his chest. "It wasn't just you, Jordan," Grandpa continued, his tone shifting to something more serious. "It was everyone. That's what made this different. This neighborhood, these people, stood together. When one of us was hurt, we didn't just let it slide. We didn't let the fear win. We rallied. We didn't have to wait for someone else to fix it. We did it ourselves." Grandpa leaned forward then, his voice lower, more intense. "That's what makes a community strong. Not the houses, not the HOA rules, not the fences and lawns. It's the people. It's the trust we place in each other. The knowledge that we've got each other's backs." He looked directly at Jordan then, as if seeing the man he was becoming. "You don't let someone walk over you, son. And you sure as hell don't let them walk over your neighbors. Because that's how the bad guys win. They divide us. They make us think we're too small, too weak to stand up. But together, there's nothing that can stop us." Jordan was quiet for a long moment. The weight of his grandfather's words settled in, and for the first time since the whole ordeal had started, he truly understood the depth of what had happened. It wasn't just about those two men or what they did. It was about standing up to the kind of thinking that lets people take advantage of others, about fighting back in the way that really matters without becoming what you're fighting against. Grandpa's hand moved, gently resting on Jordan's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, not exactly. More like a reminder. "Resilience is in the quiet moments, too," Grandpa said softly. "It's in how you carry yourself when things get hard, how you pick up the pieces afterward. People forget that. They think it's about the big moments. But what really matters is what we do every single day. The choices we make when no one's watching." Jordan sat up straighter, letting those words sink in. He hadn't fully grasped it until now, but there it was, the truth as Grandpa always delivered it. That justice isn't just about confronting wrongs head-on. It's about recognizing them when they happen, standing tall, and supporting the people around you. It's about never letting fear or intimidation break you, and making sure that no one else has to feel that way, either. As the light faded, the sound of laughter from down the street filled the air. Neighbors, real neighbors, walking dogs, chatting, and enjoying the evening. Life had returned to normal, but it was different now. More connected, more aware. Grandpa sat back again, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "This," he said, gesturing to the street, the people, the quiet safety of the evening. "This is what we protect, not just with our fists, but with our hearts." And our eyes open. Jordan nodded. There was so much he still had to learn, but he was starting to understand what it meant to stand up. Not just for himself, but for everyone else who needed someone to notice when things went wrong. And Grandpa had shown him how to do it as the weeks passed. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The wounds, both physical and emotional, began to heal. Jordan's fingers, though still a little stiff, no longer ached like they had in those first days after the confrontation. His confidence was coming back, bit by bit, as he saw the strength of the community he now truly understood. The neighbors, those who had stayed quiet, those who had been too afraid to speak out, found their voices again. There were block parties, cookouts, and people simply sitting on porches, chatting about everything and nothing. What had once been a place of tension and uncertainty now felt like a home again. The children ran through yards, their laughter carrying through the air, uninhibited. There was a sense of unity now, a shared understanding that they were stronger together than apart. Grandpa's health, while still fragile, improved in the way it always did. He was the same quiet figure he'd been before, but there was a certain pride in his step now, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing his actions had made a difference. He would often sit on the porch, his cane resting beside him, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. He never said much, he didn't need to. He saw everything in a way most people didn't. The truth of the world wasn't always found in grand gestures. Sometimes it was in the small, steady things. The way neighbors helped one another, the trust that had been rebuilt, the quiet resilience that flowed through the block like a river finding its course again. And Jordan? He wasn't the same young man who had moved into the neighborhood, eager for a fresh start. He had changed. There was a new weight to his actions now. He carried himself with a strength he hadn't realized he had, and a deep respect for those who chose to stand up, even when the odds were against them. He had seen the fragility of power, the fleeting nature of authority built on lies. But he had also seen the power of truth, how one person, standing firm, could change everything. One evening, not long after the case had been closed, Jordan found himself sitting next to Grandpa once again, just the two of them as the sun dipped behind the horizon. "Do you ever regret it?" Jordan asked, a question that had been on his mind for weeks, since that moment when Grandpa had taken control of the situation. "Going after them, I mean." Grandpa took a long, slow breath, his gaze softening as he looked out at the street. "I regret a lot of things, kid," he said quietly, "but I don't regret doing what was right." He turned to face Jordan, his voice steady. "Sometimes, doing the right thing is the hardest thing you'll ever do. But if you don't stand up when it matters, if you don't take a stand against what's wrong, you lose more than just the fight. You lose yourself." The air was still, the neighborhood settled in its usual evening calm. Jordan sat with the weight of Grandpa's words pressing into him. This wasn't just about them or even the fake HOA officers. This was about the world they all lived in, the way injustice, however small, could creep in and fester if it wasn't confronted. It was about the integrity that formed the backbone of everything, about standing firm when the truth needed to be spoken. "Sometimes, the hardest thing is to believe that what we do matters," Jordan said, his voice low but steady. "But I guess it does." Grandpa smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "That's right. It matters. Every time." As the stars began to dot the sky above them, the quiet hum of the neighborhood filled the air. Life wasn't perfect. The world wasn't perfect. But here, in this small corner of it, they had learned something that would stick with them for the rest of their lives. That no one, no matter how small or quiet, should ever stand by while injustice plays out. And sometimes, standing up doesn't take more than the courage to face what's wrong and do something about it. One moment, one choice, one act of integrity. That's how change begins.